So, and of course, why wouldn't they? Because you can trust them, and they work, and so those are both good things. So then you think, okay, so men have adapted to start to climb the male dominance hierarchy, but it's the set of all possible hierarchies that they're adapted to climb. And so then you think there's a set of attributes that can be acted out that can be embodied that will increase the probability that you're going to rise to the top of any given hierarchy. And then you could say, well, that as you adapt to that fact, then you start to develop an understanding of what that pattern constitutes. And so that starts to become the abstract representation of something like multidimensional competence. And that's like the abstraction of virtue itself. Well, and none of that's arbitrary, man. That's as bloody well grounded in biology as anything could be. And I think that's a really hard argument to refute. And like one of the things I should tell you about how I think is that when I think something, I spend a long time trying to figure out if it's wrong, because I like to hack at it from every possible direction to see if it's a weak idea, because if it's a weak idea, then I'd rather just dispense with it and find something better. And I've had a real hard time trying to figure out what's wrong with that idea. It seems to me that it's pretty damn solid. And then the idea that, if you watch what people do in movies and so on, and when they're reading fiction, it's obvious that they're very good at identifying both the hero and the anti-hero. We could say the anti-hero, generally speaking, the bad guy, is someone who strives for authority and position, but fails. Generally speaking, not always, but fails. So he's a good, bad example. You take a kid to a good guy, bad guy movie, the kid figures out pretty fast that he's not supposed to be the bad guy, and figures out very quickly to zero in on the good guy. And that means that there's an affinity between the pattern of good guy that's being played out in the fiction and the perceptual capacity of the child. And one of the things I told my son when he was a kid, when I used to take him to movies that were sometimes more frightening than they should have been, but one of the things I always told him was, I never said don't be afraid, because I think that's bad advice for kids. What I said was, keep your eye on the hero, right? Keep your eye on the hero. And he was gripped by the movie, and often quite of them, because movies can be very frightening, so he'd just zero in on that guy and hoping, and you know what it's like in a movie, you hope that the good guy wins, generally speaking. And I mean, why do you do that? Where does that come from? You see how deeply rooted that is inside you. You'll bloody well go line up and pay to watch that happen. It's not an easy thing to understand, and it's so self-evident to people that we don't even notice that it's a tremendous mystery. And so is it so unreasonable to think that we would have actually, over the millennia, come to some sort of collective conclusion about what the best of the best guys are, best of the good guys are, and what the worst of the bad guys are? And to me, archetypally speaking, thinking of that as the hostile brothers, so that's Christ and Satan, or Cain and Abel, for example, very common mythological motif, the hostile brothers, it's like those are archetypes. It's like the Satan, for example, is by definition the worst that a person can be. And Christ, by definition, this is independent of anything but conceptualization, is by definition the best that a man can be. Now, as I said, I'm speaking psychologically and conceptually, but given our capacity for imagination and our ability to engage in fiction, and our love for fiction, and our capacity to dramatize, and our love for the stories of heroism and catastrophe and good and evil, I can't see how it could be any other way. So that's part of the idea that's driving the notion of the evolution of the idea of God, and even more specifically, driving the evolution of the idea, at least in part, of the Trinity. So God is an abstracted ideal formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or any ruler. And there's another rule in the biblical stories, which is that when the actual ruler, I mentioned this before, when the actual ruler becomes confused with the abstracted ideal, then the state immediately turns into a tyranny and the whole bloody thing collapses. So the idea is so sophisticated. One of the things that we figured out, and this was a hard thing to figure out, was that you had to take the abstraction and divorce it from any particular power structure, and then think about it as something that existed as an abstraction, but a real thing, right? Real in that it governed your behavior, in everyone's behavior, including the damn king. The king was responsible to the abstracted ideal. Man, that is such an impossible ideal. Why would have they agreed to that 5,000 years ago? But one of the things you see continually happening in the Old Testament is that as soon as the Israelite, for example, the Israelite kings become almighty, the real God comes along and just cuts them into pieces, and then the whole bloody state falls apart for like hundreds of years. It's like, I think that's a lesson that we have not thoroughly, consciously yet learned. It's still implicit in the narratives. We still haven't figured out why that's the case. Well, again, I think that's a real hard argument to dispense with. So, all right. So we looked at this a little bit. The Trinitarian idea is that there's a father. That's maybe the dramatic representation of the structures that underlie consciousness, the embodied structures that underlie consciousness. And then there's the Son, and that's consciousness, but in its particular historical form. That's the thing that's so interesting about the figure of the Son. And then there's consciousness as such, and that seems to be something like the indwelling spirit. And so, I mean, these psychological ideas came from somewhere, right? That they have a history. They didn't just spring out of nowhere, and they emerged from dreams and hypotheses and artistic visions and all of that over a long time, and maybe they get clarified into something like consciousness, but it takes a damn long time to get from watching, from two chimpanzees watching each other to a human being saying, well, we all exhibit this faculty called consciousness. I mean, man, that's a long journey, that's a really long journey, and there's going to be plenty of stages in between. One of the things I really like about Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, was that he was so insistent that children act out and dramatize ideas before they understand them. And Merlin Donald, who was a psychologist at Queen's University, wrote a couple of interesting books along those lines as well, looking at the importance of imitation for the development of higher cognition in human beings. And so the notion that we embody ideas before we abstract them out and then represent them in an articulated way, I think is an extraordinarily solid idea. And I really can't see how it could be any other way. And if you watch children, you see that. Like, think about what a child is doing when he plays house, or she plays house. The child acts out the father or the mother. But what's so interesting about it, and you think, well, look, isn't that cute? She's imitating her mother. It's like, no, she's not. That's not what happens. Because when your child imitates you, it's very annoying. Because you move your arm, and then they move their arm, and, that you move your head. They copy you. No one likes that. It's direct imitation. That's not what a child's doing when the child is playing. What the child is doing is watching the mother over multiple instantiations, and then extracting out the spirit called mother. And that's whatever is mother-like across all those multiple manifestations, and then laying out that pattern internally and manifesting itself in an abstract world. It's so sophisticated. It's just, that's what you're doing when you're playing house or having a tea party or taking care of a doll. It's not like you've seen your mother take care of a doll. You haven't seen that. It's that you're smart enough to pull out the abstraction and then embody it. And certainly the child is attempting to strive towards an ideal at that point. She's not lighting her doll on fire, or it's, well, with, certain exceptions, but generally ones that we try to not encourage, right? So you see that capacity in children, and it's something we also know that if children don't engage in that sort of dramatic and pretend play to a tremendous degree, that they don't get properly socialized. It's really a critical element of developing self-understanding, and then also developing the capability of being with others, because what you do when you're a child, especially around the age of 4, is you jointly construct a shared fictional world. We'll play house together, let's say, and then you act out your joint roles within that shared fictional world, and that's a form of a very advanced cognition. It's very sophisticated, and I see that, and Piaget did as well, and so did Jung, and so did Freud, these brilliant observers, and also Merlin Donald, these brilliant observers of the manner in which cognition came to be. They noted very clearly that embodied imitation and dramatic abstraction constituted the ground out of which higher abstract cognition emerged. And how could it not be? Because obviously we were mostly bodies before we were minds, clearly. And so we were acting out things way before we understood them, just like the chimpanzees act out the idea that you have to act reasonably sensibly if you're a head chimpanzee, or you're going to get yourself ripped apart. And you see that in wolves, because when wolves have a dominance dispute, they puff up their hair at each other to look big, and they growl and bark, and they're very menacing. And one wolf chickens out, rolls over, puts up his neck, and basically what he's saying is, yeah, I'm pretty useless, so you can kill me if you want to. And the other wolf says, yeah, you're pretty useless, and I could tear out your throat, but tomorrow we might need to bring down a wolf, or a moose, so I'll keep you around. And it's not like they think that, because they don't know. They don't think that. They act it out as a behavioral pattern. Then if you're an anthropologist or an ethologist, and you went and watched the wolves, you'd say it's as if they were acting according to the following rule. And that often confused me, because I thought, well, do wolves act out rules? And I thought, no. A rule is what we construct when we articulate a behavioral pattern. Right? We observe a stable behavioral pattern, and when we articulate it, we can call it a rule. But for the wolves, it's not a rule, it's just a stable behavioral pattern. And so we acted like wolf troops or chimpanzee troops, all of that, and for untold tens and perhaps hundreds of millions of years before we were able to formulate that pattern of behavior in anything approximating a story or an image, and even longer before we could articulate it as a set of ethical rules. And I'm dwelling on this. I know I've repeated some of this before, but it's so important because, there's this tremendous push, especially from the social constructionists, to make the case that ethics is arbitrary, morality is relative, there's no fundamental biological grounding in relationship to human behavior, especially in the category of ethics. And I think that that's, well, first of all, it's dangerous, because that means that people are anything you want to turn them into, and you bloody well better be careful of people who think that. And second, I just think that the evidence that that's wrong is so overwhelming that we should just stop thinking that way. I mean, and that's partly why I'm also attacking this from an evolutionary perspective. There's lots of converging lines of evidence that ethical standards of at least of the most crucial sort not only evolve, but also spontaneously reemerge, for example, in the dramatic play of children. So we need to take that seriously. And so, well, that's partly what we're doing here, trying to take that seriously. So, okay, so the idea there, at least in part, was that the father employed the son to generate habitable order out of chaos. I also think there might be something more proximally true about that as well, too, because one of the things we do know, here's something that's cool about men. Men are much more criminal than women. And that, by the way, that does not look like it's sociocultural, partly because it peaks when testosterone kicks in around 14, like it just spikes the hell up, and then it stays pretty high until about 27. And so standard penological theory, for those of you who don't know this, is that if you have a repeat offender, a guy who just won't stop getting in trouble, you just throw him in prison until he's 28. And it isn't like you're rehabilitating him or anything. It's like by 28, he's done with his criminal career, because the crime curve peaks at 15 and then falls down around 27 or so. It burns out. And that's often, by the way, that's often when men get married and settle down and stabilize. One of the things that's cool about that is the creativity curve for men is almost exactly the same thing. It ramps up when testosterone kicks in, and then it starts to flatten out around 27. The curves match very, very closely. So that's quite cool. It's the creativity element of it that I'm particularly interested in, because the creativity is, in many ways, an attribute of youth. And that's, look, I mean, if you looked at that sentence and you stripped it of its religious context, what you would say is that, well, the older people use the younger people to generate creative ideas and renew the world. It's like, yeah, that's what happens. And we also have no idea how many of the things that we discovered or invented as human beings were stumbled across by children and adolescents. Because they're much more exploratory. They're less constrained by their already extant knowledge structures, and they're less conservative. So, yeah, that seems just right to me. So, and right in an extraordinarily important way. Because it also means that if you're an actual father, one of the things that it means is that that's part of what you should be encouraging your son to do, right? Which is because the role of a father is to encourage. That is clearly the role. And to encourage is to say, well, go out there, confront the chaos of the unknown and the chaos that underlies everything, and grapple with it, because you can do it. You're as big as the chaos itself, and do something useful as a consequence, and make your life better, and make everyone else's life better, and you can do it. And man, that's the right thing to tell. That's the right thing to tell young men. And now, talking to young women is more complicated because they have more, let's say, issues to deal with, because their lives are more complicated in some ways. But that's definitely the right thing to be telling your son. And one of the things that I've really noticed recently, since I've been lecturing, especially in the last 7 or 8 months, most of my audience has been young men, and I've talked a lot to them about both truth and responsibility. And I think that those are the two things that underlie this capacity. And there seems to me to be a tremendous hunger for that idea. It's not the same idea as rights, It's a very different idea. It's the counterpart to rights. And so it's, life is hard, it's chaotic, it's difficult, it's really definitely a challenge. And so you can either shrink from that, and no bloody wonder, because it's going to kill you. It's no joke, man. Or you can forthrightly confront it and try to do something about it. Well, what's better? And then you say to the person, look, man, you could do it. Like, that's what a human being is like. And if you just stood up and got yourself together, and you'd find out by trying that you can in fact do that. And I do think that that's a great core religious message as far as I can tell, and I think that's deeply embedded in this sort of idea. So, all right, so this is what I've been telling you. This is something like how knowledge itself is generated. First of all, there's the unknown as such, and that's really what you don't know anything about. And generally, when you encounter that, you don't encounter it with thought. You encounter it like this, right? And that's the first representation of the absolutely unknown. It's something that is beyond your comprehension, and it's terrifying. And because it's beyond your comprehension, you cannot perceive it, you cannot understand it, but you still have to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is that you freeze. That's what a basilisk does, say, to the kids in Harry Potter, right? They take a look at it and they freeze. And that's the snake, the terrible snake of chaos that lives underneath everything. You see that thing freezes you. And that's because you're a prey animal. But at the same time, it makes you curious. And so that's the first level of contact with the absolute unknown, is the emotional combination of freezing and curiosity. And that's reflected, I think, in the dragon stories. The dragon is the terrible thing that lives underground that hoards gold or hoards virgins. Very, very strange behavior for a reptile, as we pointed out before. But the idea is that it's a symbolic representation of the predatory quality of the unknown combined with the capacity of the unknown to generate nothing but novel information. And you can see that as very characteristic of human beings, because we are prey animals. But we're also unbelievably exploratory, and we're pretty damn good predators. And we occupy this weird cognitive niche. And so one of the things we've learned is that if we forthrightly confront the unknown, terrifying as it is, there's a massive prize to be gained continually. And so that seems to be true, right? As true as anything is. And then I would also say that idea, now we know that one of the metaphors that underlies God's extraction of habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time is an older idea, and a more archaic idea, that God confronted something like the Leviathan. That's one of the words for this serpent-like chaos creature that's often used in the Old Testament, or there's the Leviathan and the Behemoth. Yeah, that's the other thing. And so there's this idea that I think probably came from the Mesopotamians, that God, either in the son-like aspect or in the father-like aspect, is the thing that confronts this terrible beast that represents the chaotic unknown and cuts it into pieces, and then sometimes gives the body parts to the populace in order to feed them. So you can see a hunting metaphor there as well, but it's deeper than that. And so, all right, so The first thing is that there's the absolute unknown, and the unknown is what you do not understand. It's what's beyond the campfire. Maybe it's what's beyond the tree, even more anciently, you know, when we lived in trees. It's out there where you don't know. And what's out there? Crocodiles and snakes and birds of prey and cats and all sorts of things, like predatory cats, and they will eat you. But there's utility in going out there to find out what's there. Like maybe you go and you don't kill the snake, you kill the damn nest of snakes. And that makes you pretty popular, just as you should be. And that accelerates your reproductive potential, let's say. And we're descended from people who did that. And so we have this notion about how the world is structured that's deeply embedded in our psyche. Like really, really deeply, way, way down, way below the surface cognition. Way down in the limbic system, in these ancient parts of the brain that are like 60 million years old or 100 million years old or older than that. Ancient, ancient brain structures. And so the first thing we do is we act out our encounter with the unknown world. And we act that out in the same way, in a manner that's analogous to the manner that's presented as a description of what it is that God does at the beginning of time to extract habitable order out of chaos. And I won't tell you about the other part of that for now. So you act it out first. And then the second thing is, you watch people who act it out and you start to make representations of that. That's stories, right? And maybe you admire them. And then after a long time, you collect a bunch of those stories and then you can say what that is. You can articulate it as a pattern. And this is something Nietzsche also figured out to begin with, you know, because prior to Nietzsche, I would say, he did so many things first. It was quite remarkable. You know, there was an idea that you first think and then you act. And people like to think that, but of course you know it's complete bloody rubbish because you're as impulsive as you can possibly imagine. You're always doing things before you think. And sometimes that's a really good idea. So the idea that you see things and then think and then act, it's like, yeah, really? No, I'm sorry. I don't do that. No one I know does that, and they certainly don't do that when they're emotional. You know, you act first. And one of the things that Nietzsche said very clearly was that our ideas emerged out of the ground of our action over thousands and thousands of years. And then when philosophers were putting forward those ideas, what they were doing wasn't generating creative ideas. They were just telling the story of humanity. And it's already there. It's already in us. It's already in our patterns of behavior. And it strikes me that that's, well, he was a genius, and that was one of his many, many observations of pure genius. And so you can think about it, you know, you can think about it like this too, is that there's the unknown and then you act in the face of the unknown and then you dream about the action. I mean, that's what you're doing in a movie theater. And then you speak about it. And so, you know, and of course, once you speak about it, that affects how you dream, and how you dream affects how you act. It's not like all of the causal direction is one way, because it's not. These things loop. But it's still from the unknown through the body, through the imagination, into articulation. That's the primary mode of the generation of wisdom, let's say. And you can easily map that onto an evolutionary explanation, because the body comes first, right? And then the imagination, which is the body in abstraction, and only then the word. And of course, that's exactly how things did evolve, because we could imagine things long before we could speak. At least that's the theory. So, and I represented it. This is an image from my book, Maps of Meaning. And so the idea is that this is the fundamental representation of the unknown as such. It's half spirit, because it partakes of the air like a bird, and it's half matter because it's on the ground like a snake. And that's what you think is there when you don't know what is there. That's how your body reacts to what's there when you don't know what is there. You know that too, because if you're alone at night, you know, and maybe you're a little rattled up for one reason or another, maybe you watched a horror movie and, you know, there's some weird noise in the other room, it's dark, and you could just try this once. It's like, so you're on edge, you think, you want to turn the light on and go in the room and see. Don't do that. Just open the door a little bit and sneak your hand in. And just watch what your imagination fills that room with, right? And then you remember what it's like to be 3 years old in bed and afraid of the dark, right? And I read a good book on dragons recently that had a very interesting hypothesis about them, I thought. One of the things the guy did was track, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, track how common the image of the dragon was worldwide. It's unbelievably widespread. It's crazily widespread. And he thought that this was actually the category of primate predator. And the predator was, so predator is a weird category, right? Because like there's crocodiles in it and there's lions, and they don't have much in common except they eat you. So it's a functional category. And so this is the imagistic representation of the functional category of predator. And his predator theory was, well, if you're a monkey, then a bird would pick you off, like an eagle. And so that's this, right? And then if it wasn't an eagle, it was a cat, because they climb trees and give you good chomping. And then if it wasn't a cat, then you go down on the ground and a snake would get you, or maybe a snake would climb up the tree, because snakes like to do that, and get you. And so that's a tree cat snake, basically. Tree cat snake bird. And that's the thing you really want to avoid. You don't want to come across one of those. And so, and then, you know, the other thing it does is breathe fire, which is quite interesting, because obviously fire was both greatest friend and greatest enemy of humanity. And we've mastered fire for a long time. It might be as long as 2 or 3 million years. That's what Richard Wrangham, I think it's Wrangham, he wrote a book recently on, I think it was Wrangham, who wrote a book on when human beings learned to cook. That was about 2 million years ago. And cooking increased the availability of calories. You know how chimpanzees are sort of shaped like a big, like they're ugly. They're shaped like a big bowling ball, you know. They look really fat, and they're short and they're wide, and that's because they have intestinal tracts that are like, you know, 300 miles long. And the reason for that is because they have to digest leaves. And so you go out in the forest and like sit there and eat leaves for a whole day and see how that works out for you, you know. They have no calories in them. So chimps spend about, I think it's 8 hours a day chewing. And it's because what they eat has no nutritional value, and then they have to have this tremendous gut in order to extract anything at all out of it. And human beings at some point just thought, oh, to hell with that, we'll cook something. And then we traded our gut for brain, which, you know, more or less has worked, and I think it's made us a lot more attractive as well. So the idea here was that, well, that's the basic archetype of the unknown as such. And then I like the St. George version of this. It's so cool because St. George lives in a castle, and the castle is partly falling down, and it's partly because there's a dragon that's come up to, like it's an eternal dragon, it's come back to give everyone a rough time, which always happens, because the eternal dragon is always giving our fallen down castles a rough time, always. And so then St. George is the hero who goes out to confront the dragon, and he frees the virgin from its grasp. And I would say that's a pretty straightforward story about the sexual attractiveness of the masculine spirit that's willing to forthrightly encounter the unknown. It looks just straight, looks like a straight biological representation to me. And it's a really, really old story, right? It's the oldest written story we have, and that's basically the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Anu Elish, which basically lays out precisely that story. And so, and it's replayed. I mean, I bet you, the moviegoers among you, especially the ones that are more attracted to the superhero, you know, the really flashy sort of superhero type movies, you've probably seen the St. George story like 150 times in the last 10 years. You never get tired of it because it's the central story of mankind. So you've got the unknown as such, and that is what you react to with your body in the existential terror and extraordinary curiosity are gripping you. And then it's like the unknown unknowns that, who's the politician under Bush? Rumsfeld. Yeah, I think the reason that phrase caught on so well is because he nailed an archetype. There's unknown unknowns and there's known unknowns. And that's the unknown unknown. And you have to be able to react to an unknown unknown because they can get you. And you can't just plead ignorance because then you're dead. That doesn't work. Like, human beings are the sort of creature who has to know what to do when they don't know what to do. And that's very paradoxical. And what we do is we prepare to do everything. That's right. We're on guard. We prepare to do everything. Very, very stressful. But also very engaging and very, very much something that heightens consciousness. And maybe those circuits are permanently turned on in human beings because we also know that we're going to die, and no other animal knows that. And so sometimes I think that our stress circuits are just on all the time, and that's part of what accounts for our heightened consciousness.